Hello, Vudani here, and I'm gonna show you a Necromancer build today. This build, in my opinion, is the highest damaging Necromancer build out there. It is a condition build, so while it is, in my opinion, the highest damaging, it can also be countered with condition removals. You shouldn't really be worried about that though, because this build is going to be applying conditions incredibly fast. It's not going to be burning people, but it will be applying bleeds non-stop. The heal I'm using here is Consume Conditions. It is, in my opinion, the best heal for Necro. The ability to remove the conditions and get more health per condition is very valuable. Plague Signet is going to help you control conditions even more. It's going to allow you to get conditions and then put them on other people. Blood as Power is pretty decent. It got nerfed a little bit, but it's still pretty solid. It's gonna bleed you as well as your opponent, which can be amplified more with Plague Signet. And Spectral Armor is a very solid stun break. It's gonna give you a decently long protection buff, as well as improved life force regeneration. And for the ultimate, Lich Form is a very strong ultimate if you have high crit, which this build has no shortage of crit. This is going to be a very high damaging ultimate. It's not going to bleed too often, but the crit damage you'll see from this is pretty high. Most of the damage you'll see from Lich Form is going to come in the form of Deadly Claws. That is your number 1 ability, and it does a very high damage attack from 1200 range with a small AoE. Your number 2 is Marked for Death. It's a AoE mark that causes a very high vulnerability as well as damage. Number 3 is Chilling Wind. It's a decent knockback and chill, but if you're in melee range with this ability, you're probably doing it wrong. Mark of Horror is not that great. It's another mark, obviously. You place it on the ground, it's going to summon some jagged horrors. And Grim Spectre is a very strong ability. It sends out a claw, and it's going to do an AoE that removes conditions from allies and strips boons from enemies. This build is going to be using 10 in Spite, 30 in Curses, and 30 in Soul Reaping. I'll give you a quick visual of the trait choices, and then I'm going to bring up the actual descriptions of each trait. With the Spite tree, the main reason to get this is for the 10% condition duration. You'll also pick up the Might for 15 seconds when you Life Blast, which is actually going to stack up quite a bit as you will be in Death Shroud form quite often. The 30 points into Curses is going to give you a pretty good precision boost as well as condition damage. It will also give you quite a few proactive skills that will help with your bleeding. It will give you a chance to bleed on critical hits as well as regenerating life force on critical hits. It will improve your bleeding duration, and it will also improve conditions from scepters, which is going to be the majority of your conditions. The 30 points into Soul Reaping is going to be mainly for your Death Shroud and your Lich Form. 30% critical damage is very potent with those. It will also help you with your life force. It will drain slower while you're in Death Shroud, and it will also make your Death Shroud's Life Blast pierce and cause vulnerability. And it will lower the recharge rate on Death Shroud, which is very useful for very tight situations. My gear choices with this build are very typical of a condition build. I took the Rampager's Amulet with the Jewel. For runes, I have Rune of the Afflicted for bleeding duration, Rune of the Crate for bleeding duration, and Rune of Lissa for condition duration. On my weapons, I went with all Superior Earth, as the bleed with that is very nice. With Necro builds, you're going to think of Death Shroud as sort of another life, and it is very useful. You'll have Life Blast, which is your number 1 attack. It's going to do a decent amount of damage, less if you're lower on life force, but if you have high life force, not only is it going to stack might, but it will pierce. Dark Path is your number 2. It's going to chill people. It's good for kiting, all-around good skill to use when you go into Death Shroud. Doom is your number 3. It's a short fear, another skill you'll want to use when you go into Death Shroud every time. And your last skill, Life Transfer, is fairly useful. It's good in an AoE situation when you're surrounded. It's going to generate life force as well as damage foes. While Death Shroud can be used offensively if you enter a fight with full life force, it is mostly a defensive cooldown. Something to pop and hopefully try to get away using the skills available in Death Shroud. However, the goal is obviously to not get into a situation that you'll need Death Shroud. You're going to want to be applying Blood Curse, which is your number 1 weapon skill with the Scepter. and it's going to bleed your enemies. And the third chain in that is going to poison, so it will constantly be applying bleeds. Your number 2 skill is Grasping Death. It's a bleed as well and also a cripple, very good for kiting. Number 3 is Feast of Corruption. It's going to do a decent amount of damage and more damage per condition. You'll want to use that if you do see someone with a lot of conditions. This will generally happen when you have a lot of allies around. Wail of Doom comes from the Warhorn. It is a short 2-second daze, which is a good defensive cooldown if someone gets on you. And Locust Swarm is going to be mostly for movement. It's also going to cripple, but the swiftness you get from that is nice. It's a very, well, not very long, but it's a fairly long duration skill that you can have up a lot of the time. Your staff you're not going to be using too often, but it is more of a preemptive weapon. The normal attack from the staff isn't very overwhelming. It's just a basic bolt, low damage. And your marks are why you're going to have this. You'll have from left to right Mark of Blood, Chillbane's, Putrid Mark, and Reaper's Mark. All 4 of those are ground targeted attacks that you can place on the ground and just kind of let them sit there. The first Mark of Blood is going to bleed enemies and regenerate allies. Chillbane's, your number 3, is going to chill and poison enemies. Putrid Mark, your number 4, is going to do a small damage as well as a blast finisher, which is good for working in chain with classes like Elementalist. Lastly, your 5 skill Reaper's Mark is going to cause a short fear. And that about sums it up for what this build has to offer. It is a build that you will obviously want to stay out of melee range. If you're in melee range, however, you do have defensive abilities to counter it. But generally, you're going to want to be applying cripples and bleeds from afar. As always, I hope this video is helpful, and if you do try this build, let me know how it goes. Pretty soon here I'll post up a full game of this build to let you know how a general game with this goes, and thanks for watching.